Have you ever questioned the unspoken rules within your own family? Those invisible lines we're told never to cross? Sometimes, life throws you a curveball, blurring those boundaries in ways you never imagined. What happens when a simple family visit unexpectedly ignites feelings you never anticipated, leading you down a path you never thought possible? Get ready to hear a story about unexpected connections, hidden desires, and the complicated lines of family. A simple question hung in the air, breaking the silence and unraveling everything I thought I understood about family and boundaries. I never imagined that a single visit could make me question it all, but life has a way of surprising us in ways we never expect. I had always been the cool uncle, the one my nephews and nieces turned to when they needed someone who wouldn't judge, someone who'd let them get away with a little more than their parents would. My nephew, Ethan in particular, had always looked up to me, and I was happy to fill that role, especially now that he was an adult. He was 21, fresh out of college, and at a point in life where he was testing new waters, figuring out who he was outside of the family bubble. When my brother asked if Ethan could stay with me for a few weeks while he figured out some job prospects in the city, I didn't hesitate. It sounded like a great opportunity to catch up, maybe even showing the ropes a bit. After all, the transition to adulthood wasn't exactly a walk in the park, and I remember my own struggles during that stage all too well. So Ethan arrived one warm afternoon in June. From the moment he walked in, I could tell he'd grown, not just taller or broader, but more confident, more self-assured in a way that surprised me. There's a sense of maturity in his demeanor, something that hadn't been there before, but I could still see traces of the kid I used to know, the quick smile, the inquisitive glances, the laughter that seemed to fill every corner of a room. In some ways, Ethan was still the same, yet he was different, and I couldn't help but be intrigued by that transformation. We spent the first evening just talking, catching up on life and family, and laughing over childhood stories. Ethan seemed genuinely curious about my life, asking me questions that no one in the family had ever thought to ask. It was refreshing, to say the least. I wasn't used to sharing that much about myself, but there was something in the way he listened that made me want to open up. "So, Uncle Alex," he said at one point, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression, "do you ever feel like you're living the life you actually wanted or the one that was expected of you?" His question took me by surprise. I hadn't expected such a deep question from him, especially not on the first night, but I couldn't deny that it struck a chord. I thought for a moment before replying. "I suppose a little of both," I admitted. "There are things I love about my life. Sure, but there are also things I wish I'd done differently." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, as if he understood exactly what I meant. We talked for a while longer, delving into topics that felt more personal than I had anticipated. It was strange, this newfound openness between us, but it felt good. Like we were finally seeing each other as adults rather than the one-dimensional roles we'd been assigned by the family. The next day, Ethan and I slipped into an easy routine. I'd head to work in the morning, leaving him to explore the city or relax at home. And in the evenings, we'd cook dinner together, sharing stories over glasses of wine. It didn't take long for me to realize that Ethan had a way of making everything feel more exciting, more alive. He had this knack for finding joy in the simplest things. Whether it was a late-night conversation, a new recipe, or even just a walk around the neighborhood. It was infectious, his enthusiasm, and I found myself looking forward to the end of each day, knowing he'd be there with a smile and some new observation to share. One evening, as we sat on the patio with the lights of the city twinkling in the distance, Ethan turned to me with that same inquisitive expression. "Uncle Alex, have you ever regretted not having kids of your own?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt a strange mix of emotions rise to the surface. I hadn't thought about it in a long time, but this was a part of me that sometimes wondered if I'd missed out on something. Seeing Ethan grow up, watching him evolve into the person he was now, made me think about the what-ifs of life in a way that was both bittersweet and comforting. "I don't know if I'd say regret," I replied slowly, "but sometimes I wonder, I wonder what life would have been like if I'd taken a different path." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady and understanding. I think we all feel like that sometimes, like we're walking a tightrope between who we are and who we could have been. I had a smile at his words. He was wiser than I remembered, and I felt a strange sense of pride in seeing how far he'd come. But the story didn't end there. One morning a few days later, I found myself in an unexpected situation that would bring us even closer. Over the following days, that tension between us only seemed to grow. It was like a current running just beneath the surface, pulling us both in directions neither of us had anticipated. Ethan seemed to linger around me more often, finding excuses to strike up conversations, to spend time in my presence. I told myself it was innocent, just a young man reconnecting with family, but deep down I felt a pull that I couldn't ignore. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Ethan looked over at me, his expression unusually serious. "Uncle Alex, can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, trying to keep my voice light. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "Do you ever feel like there's something more between people? I mean, like a connection that goes beyond words?" The question hung in the air, and I felt my pulse quicken. I wasn't sure how to respond, unsure of what he was really asking. "Sometimes, I guess. It's rare, though. Why do you ask?" Ethan shrugged, looking away, but I could see the hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't know, just been thinking about it, I guess." His words echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended, stirring up thoughts and emotions I had tried to ignore. That night, I lay awake replaying his question in my head, wondering if I had missed something all along. There was a part of me that wanted to brush it off, to tell myself it was nothing, but another part, the part one could no longer deny, was curious, tempted by the mystery that seemed to have settled between us. A few days later, I found myself alone in the apartment. Ethan had gone out with some friends, and the silence left in his absence was almost deafening. I wandered around the rooms, my mind drifting back to our conversations, to the subtle shifts in his demeanor, to the way he had looked at me with that quiet intensity. It was strange feeling his absence so keenly, as if the air itself felt emptier without him there. When he finally returned, it was late, and he looked a bit flushed, like he'd been drinking. He gave me a lopsided grin as he stumbled through the door, and I couldn't help but smile back despite the strange mixture of emotions his presence seemed to stir within me. "Had a good time?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Yeah," he replied, his voice warm but a little slurred. "But I'm glad to be back here." He settled onto the couch, patting the seat beside him with a grin. "Come on, Uncle Alex, join me for a bit." I hesitated, but something in his expression, in the way he looked at me with that easy familiarity, drew me in. I sat down beside him, feeling the warmth radiate from his body as he leaned back, his gaze drifting over me with a quiet intensity that I could no longer ignore. For a long time, we sat in silence, the unspoken tension between us thickening with each passing moment. Ethan shifted, his arm brushing against mine, and I felt a strange thrill at the unexpected closeness, at the realization that there was something here, something I hadn't seen before. "Uncle Alex," he murmured, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Do you ever think about what might have been if things were different?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt my heart pound in response. There was an intimacy in his words, a vulnerability that felt almost dangerous, and yet I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Instead, I looked at him, meeting his gaze with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation, wondering where this conversation was leading us. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, "But life doesn't work like that, Ethan. We can't go back and change things." He nodded, his expression thoughtful, but I could see the hint of frustration in his eyes. "I know, but sometimes I wish it did." There was a weight in his words, a gravity that hung between us, pulling us closer in ways I hadn't anticipated. I wanted to say something to break the silence that had wrapped itself around us, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was sit there, feeling the intensity of his gaze, the quiet yearning in his expression. It was a moment suspended in time, a fragile balance between curiosity and restraint, between the pull of what could be and the weight of what already was. As I sat there caught between the past and the present, I realized that this was only the beginning, that whatever had started between us was far from over. There was a quiet inevitability in the way things unfolded between us. It was as though a boundary had dissolved without us even realizing it, replaced by an unspoken understanding. Ethan and I carried on as if nothing had changed, but beneath the surface, something was undeniably shifting, pulling us toward each other in ways that felt both thrilling and unsettling. One evening after another long day at work, I found Ethan waiting for me in the living room, sprawled comfortably on the couch with a book in hand. He glanced up as I entered, offering me a soft smile that seemed to carry a weight I couldn't quite place. It was a simple look, but it sent a wave of warmth through me, a feeling that was becoming more familiar each day. "Hey," he said, his voice low and inviting. "How was work?" "Tiring," I replied, loosening my tie as I sat down across from him. "But seeing you here makes it better." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I felt a rush of embarrassment. But Ethan's smile only deepened. He closed his book, setting it aside as he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "Good to know I'm doing something right then," he said, his tone playful but laced with something deeper. We sat there caught in a moment that seemed to stretch on, each of us waiting for the other to break the silence. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to express the mix of emotions swirling inside me. It was both comforting and disorienting, this new dynamic between us, and I found myself wanting to stay in that silence just a little longer. Finally, Ethan moved closer, settling beside me on the couch. The warmth of his presence was almost magnetic, drawing me in, and I could feel the tension thickening, a quiet electricity that seemed to hum between us. His shoulder brushed against mine, a subtle but deliberate touch, and I felt my breath hitch as I realized just how close he was. "You know, I always looked up to you," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "You've always been the one person who made me feel like I could be myself." His words hit me in a way I hadn't expected, filling me with a mixture of pride and vulnerability. "That means a lot, Ethan," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've always wanted you to feel that way." There was a pause, a moment of hesitation that seemed to hang between us. And then slowly he reached out his hand, brushing lightly against mine. It was such a simple gesture, but the touch felt intimate, as though he were reaching for something beyond just my hand. I didn't pull away, didn't even think to. Instead, I let my fingers intertwine with his, feeling the warmth of his palm against mine, a connection that seemed to bridge the gap between us. For a long moment, we sat like that, neither of us speaking, the silence filled with unspoken words, with emotions we were both too afraid to voice. But in that quiet space, I felt something shift, a sense of surrender, an acceptance of what had been building between us. Then, without warning, Ethan leaned in, his face so close to mine that I could feel his breath warm and steady brushing against my cheek. I felt my heart race, felt my pulse quicken as he closed the distance between us, his eyes searching mine for a sign, a silent permission. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. Our lips met, soft and tentative at first, a gentle exploration that spoke of both uncertainty and longing. The touch ignited a spark, our hearts beating in harmony, our bodies swaying together, melting into each other's warmth. It was a kiss that held 1,000 unspoken words, a quiet confession of everything we had been too afraid to say. Every moment, every breath, every heartbeat synchronized. Time stood still as we lingered there, wrapped in each other's arms. I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a realization that this was something I had been yearning for without even knowing it. Our connection transcended words, speaking directly to our souls. When we finally pulled apart, I saw a hint of vulnerability in Ethan's eyes, a softness that made my heart ache. He looked at me, searching my expression, trying to gauge my reaction, and I reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from his forehead with a tenderness that surprised even me. "Ethan," I began, my voice barely a whisper, unsure of what to say, how to make sense of everything that had just happened. But he only smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that told me he understood. "We don't have to say anything," he murmured, his hand still resting in mine. "Sometimes it's enough just to feel." We stayed like that, caught in a moment that felt fragile and infinite, a delicate balance between what was and what could be. And in that stillness, I felt a deep sense of peace, a quiet certainty that this was where I was meant to be. The days that followed felt like a dream, a blur of quiet moments and stolen glances that held a world of meaning. Ethan and I moved through the apartment with a new sense of closeness, an unspoken bond that seemed to deepen with each passing day. We didn't talk about what had happened, didn't try to define it or put it into words. Instead, we let the connection between us speak for itself, a silent understanding that needed no explanation. One evening, as we sat on a balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan leaned his head on my shoulder, his hand resting lightly on my arm. It was such a simple gesture, but it filled me with a sense of contentment, a feeling of being exactly where I was supposed to be. "You know, I never thought I'd want this kind of peace," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "It's like all the pieces finally fit." I didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to put into words the way he made me feel, but I reached up, placing my hand over his, and gave it a gentle squeeze, hoping he could feel the depth of my emotions through that simple touch. As we sat there bathed in the soft glow of twilight, I realized that this was what I had been searching for all along, a connection that went beyond words, a bond that needed no explanation. It was as though we had found each other in a way that defied logic, a way that made perfect sense despite everything. But even as we embraced this new closeness, there was a part of me that felt a quiet, nagging fear. I knew that what we shared was fragile, that it existed in a world that might not understand, might not accept. And though I tried to push those thoughts away, to focus on the present, I couldn't shake the feeling that our time together was limited, that the world outside would one day intrude, forcing us to confront the reality we had been so carefully avoiding. One night, as we lay side by side, Ethan turned to me, his expression serious, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Do you think we could be like this forever?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as though he were afraid to say the words out loud. I felt my heart ache at the vulnerability in his gaze, at the quiet longing that mirrored my own. I wanted to tell him yes, wanted to promise him that we could stay like this, wrapped in each other's warmth, untouched by the outside world, but I knew better. I knew that life was rarely so simple. "We can try," I replied softly, reaching up to brush a gentle strand against his forehead. "But no matter what happens out there, we'll always have this." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. And for a moment, the tension in his expression eased. We held each other close, wrapped in the silence of night, our hearts beating in sync as we drifted into a peaceful sleep. But as the days wore on, I couldn't ignore the reality that was slowly creeping in, the unspoken truth that loomed over us like a shadow. We had created a world of our own, a space where we could be ourselves, but deep down I knew that our sanctuary was fragile, that it could be shifted by the slightest shift, the smallest intrusion. And though I didn't want to face it, I knew that we couldn't stay in this dream forever. There was a part of me that feared what would come next, a quiet dread that whispered of endings and goodbyes. But for now, I pushed those thoughts away, choosing instead to savor each moment, to hold on to the beauty of what we had, even if it was fleeting, because sometimes the most precious things are the ones we cannot hold on to. And so I stayed there by his side, letting the quiet rhythm of our lives carry us forward, even as I felt the pull of reality drawing ever closer, threatening to break the fragile peace we had found. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain, that no matter where life took us, this chapter, this part of our story, would stay with me forever. But of course, the story didn't end there. The days following that quiet confession between us were filled with both ease and tension. There was something beautifully simple in our shared moments. a kind of closeness that didn't need explanation, but the weight of what we'd become and what that meant for the future began to press down on me. I couldn't ignore it, and I could see that Ethan felt it too. One afternoon, as we prepared lunch together in the kitchen, Ethan glanced at me, his expression unusually serious. "Uncle Alex, do you ever wonder where this is all going?" His question was quiet but full of weight, as though he'd been holding it in for days. I paused, setting down the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables, and met his gaze. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a cautious hope that I couldn't ignore. "Yes," I admitted, choosing my words carefully. "I think about it every day." He nodded, seeming to take comfort in my honesty. "I don't want things to change," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I know we can't stay like this forever." Hearing him say it aloud struck something deep within me, a truth I hadn't wanted to face. We were living in a kind of suspended reality, sheltered from the world outside. But that shelter wouldn't last. Sooner or later, life would find a way to intrude. I reached out, covering his hand with mine. "Ethan, whatever happens, I want you to know that you mean the world to me. This time with you has been more than I could have imagined." He looked down at our hands, his thumb gently tracing small circles on my skin. A gesture so simple, yet filled with meaning. "I feel the same way. You've been my anchor through everything. I don't know how I'd manage without you." The sincerity in his voice cut through me, filling me with a bittersweet ache. I wanted to promise him that nothing would change, that we'd always have this, but deep down I knew that wasn't realistic. We both had lives outside of this. Responsibilities, families who would never understand. A few days later, that reality came crashing in when I received a call from my brother. He was planning a visit, eager to see Ethan and check in on him. As I hung up the phone, a wave of dread washed over me, knowing that his arrival would force us to confront the choices we had been avoiding. When I told Ethan about the visit, I could see the anxiety flicker across his face. He tried to hide it, but I knew him too well. There was a fear there, a worry that this visit would mark the end of what we'd shared. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him that we'd find a way to make it work. But as the days passed and the date of my brother's arrival grew closer, I found myself struggling to keep that promise. The morning of my brother's visit, Ethan and I sat together on the couch, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. He reached over, his hand finding mine, and we sat like that, holding onto each other as though trying to make the moment last. "Alex," he said, his voice breaking the stillness, "what are we going to do?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his question settle heavily on my shoulders. "We're going to face this together," I replied, trying to sound confident. "We'll handle whatever comes, but we have to be realistic about what that might mean." He nodded, his expression filled with resignation, but also a quiet strength. "I don't regret any of this," he said softly, "not a single moment." "Neither do I," I whispered, squeezing his hand. As we sat there, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, a readiness to face whatever lay ahead. When my brother finally arrived, Ethan and I did our best to slip back into our familiar roles, the ones the family knew and expected. It was surprisingly easy, like putting on a mask that had once fit perfectly, but beneath the surface, there was an awareness, a silent understanding that had grown between us, something that no one else could see. As the evening wore on, my brother chatted happily, unaware of the complicated web that lay beneath our interactions. Ethan and I exchanged quiet glances, small smiles that held a world of meaning. And though I tried to keep things light, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end. Later that night, after my brother had gone to bed, Ethan and I found ourselves alone once more, the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging between us. He looked at me, his expression filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. "Is this really it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt my heart ache at the vulnerability in his gaze, the quiet longing that mirrored my own. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "I wish I could give you a different answer, but I don't want to lie to you, Ethan." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with emotions that cut through me. "I just wish things could be different." I reached out, pulling him into a gentle embrace, holding him close as though trying to memorize the feeling, to capture it in a way that would stay with me long after he was gone. "So do I whispered, my voice filled with a sadness I couldn't hide. We stayed like that, wrapped in each other's warmth, sharing a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. And as I held him, I realized that no matter what happened next, this chapter of our lives would always be a part of me, a memory that would live on even if our paths eventually diverged. In the days that followed, Ethan and I did our best to return to normal, slipping back into the rhythm of daily life. But there's a sense of finality in everything we did, a quiet awareness that this was our way of saying goodbye. Each moment felt bittersweet, filled with the knowledge that we were nearing the end of a journey that had brought us closer than I ever thought possible. When the day came for Ethan to leave, he packed his things with a quiet efficiency, his expression unreadable. I stood by the door, watching as he gathered his belongings, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness at the man he had become. He looked at me, offering a small, sad smile that tugged at my heart. "Thank you, Uncle Alex," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "for everything." I swallowed hard, fighting back the emotions threatening to spill over. "You don't have to thank me," I replied, reaching out to place a hand on his shoulder. "You've given me more than I could have ever asked for." He nodded, and for a moment we stood there in silence, the weight of our goodbye pressing down on us. Finally, he took a step back, his hand lingering in mine for just a second longer than necessary before he let go. "Take care of yourself," he said softly, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "You too, Ethan," I whispered, watching as he turned and walked away, each step carrying him further from the life we had shared, from the memories we had created. As the door closed behind him, a quiet emptiness settled over the apartment, a stillness that felt both comforting and heartbreaking. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had been, feeling the echoes of our time together linger in the air. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, on the journey we had taken together. It wasn't the ending I had hoped for, but it was an ending that felt right, a bittersweet farewell to a chapter that had changed me in ways I couldn't fully explain. And though he was gone, the memories we had made together stayed with me, a quiet reminder of a connection that had transcended time, circumstance, and expectation. I knew that no matter where life took us, a part of him would always be with me, a cherished memory that would remain forever etched in my heart. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I found a sense of peace in the life I had returned to, a quiet acceptance of what had been and what would never be. And though I missed him, though the ache of his absence lingered, I knew that we had given each other something rare, something beautiful, a gift that would stay with us both even as we moved forward on our separate paths. And that was the story of an unexpected connection, a reminder that sometimes life takes us on paths we never saw coming, and love can blossom in the most surprising of places. If you're moved by Alex and Ethan's story, please give this video a like. Subscribe to LGBT Stories for more emotional and heartfelt tales just like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced an unexpected connection that changed your life? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.